Okay, we're going to continue with our verse-by-verse study in the book of Matthew. It's Tuesday, September 18th, 2018. And we're going to open up in Matthew chapter 12. We're going to go into verse 1. And we'll try to go about 14 verses down tonight. And what we see in Matthew chapter 12, verse 1, starts out, at that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. So we're seeing this as we wrapped up last time, Matthew chapter 11, and we studied that out. We saw everything, how he was rebuking the unbelievers, and how previously he had set up the 12 and gave them instruction on how to go through, how to survive, how to operate with everything. And so as we're going into 12, we're seeing how he's going to go forth and operate, breaking the laws of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees have the law at their disposal, and yet they don't understand how it's supposed to work. They have the scriptures at their disposal, and yet they don't understand how the scriptures are supposed to actually be. So, with that, we'll open up in a word of prayer, and we'll get deeper into what we're talking about. So, Lord, we're thankful for your word, that we can learn more about how things were as you went into Israel's area to minister unto them, and to tell them about their kingdom and their kingdom principles and instructions. And so we're thankful as we rightly divide the word of truth that we don't need to obey any of this, but we can learn from all of it. And so we're thankful for this as we study, learn, and grow from this, and operate better as your ambassadors. Amen. So we see in verse 1, it says, at that time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn. So we're seeing the first part is that he went on the Sabbath day through the corn. And that the Sabbath day doesn't mean he went on Sunday. That's a typical wrong thinking, that the Sabbath day is Sunday. And in the scriptures, you'll see that it's from Friday night to Saturday night. And that's the actual Jewish Sabbath that is typically spoken about. But as far as having to be somewhere on a certain day today, specifically Sunday of all days, a lot of people don't like to work on Sunday. Chick-fil-A doesn't operate on Sunday, thinking it's the Sabbath day, and that's a day you're supposed to rest and not work. And so that's typically how they view that day and operate that day, according to what they believe is Sunday, the Sabbath, a day of rest. But nonetheless, we see that we understand to be Friday night through Saturday night. And so we see in the first verse, it says that Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered, and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. So this is actually a very normal thing that this would happen, that the disciples would get hungry and they would go and start plucking corn off in the fields and start to eat them. Because if we go to Leviticus chapter 23 in verse 22, we'll see an example why this would be a very common thing in Israel, a very normal thing. Leviticus 23 verse 22. And what we see here says here, Leviticus 23, verse 22, says, and when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and to the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So there was actually a law if there was someone who owned a bunch of land, and there was crops growing in it, they were to intentionally leave some of it out for people who were poor and people who were the stranger in the land, so others could go along and pick them and eat them. And that was a law. They're supposed to leave some behind for just such a purpose. And if you look again, Deuteronomy 23:25. Deuteronomy 23, verse 25. And what we'll see here is when someone does come into the field to pick the corn and eat the corn of the neighbor, they're not just to go to town on it. They're not to start getting out a reaper and just start reaping everything they can. We see there in Deuteronomy 23:25 says, "When thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor's standing corn." So again, when someone does come into the field and they see that there's corn for them to go ahead and pick, they're not just to go and take a reap and start stealing the neighbor's corn in abundance, but they can go ahead and pick and take what they need in order to eat. So there were rules and there were laws saying that someone did have to leave out some corn in Israel for the Jews. That was a law. If you had some corn, leave some of it out. And if you come into that corn, don't just take a sickle and start reaping it all off. Just take it with your hand and eat, and eat. And so when you come back to Matthew chapter 12 and verse 1, where you read, "At that time Jesus went on a Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat." You're seeing the law, the benefits or the results of people in Israel following the law, leaving some of their corn out. Just a normal thing. And then the Lord and his disciples would walk along the road or the field or whatever. They'd find the corn according to the law, and then according to Deuteronomy, they'd just pick some off and eat it. Just a normal thing that they are allowed to do according to the law. So that's verse 1. And so we see in verse 2, "But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." And the reason for that is, of course, they're taking what the law says about the Sabbath, and of course they're twisting it and misunderstanding it. They were supposed to be the authorities on the law. The Pharisees were. And the Sadducees were supposed to be the authorities on the law, but yet they misunderstood the purpose. They're supposed to obey it from the heart and not make it all about a mental head thing. And so we see in verse 2, it says, "But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." So if we go to Exodus chapter 31 and verse 15. Exodus 31, verse 15. And we'll see what the law says about that. And so actually we'll go up to verse 14. Exodus 31 and verse 14 is where we're going to read. And what it says here is that ye shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Now wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So you're seeing that the Pharisees, going back to what we're talking about, the Pharisees are taking this law, and they're making it so that they're saying, oh, you're doing that which is not lawful, which means doing anything, any work at all, just anything at all. So for them to go along and pick the ears of corn, they're saying, oh, you're working, what are you doing? And so they're trying to find pretty much anything that they can lay blame on to the Lord and his disciples. And so they're reading it all completely incorrectly, the law. But they're trying to use it to blame the Lord for anything, and to blame the disciples for anything as well. And so pretty much what they would do is they lost sight on why they were supposed to keep the law in the first place. And it was supposed to be done from the heart and not from the head. It was supposed to be obeyed for a reason. And even though nobody kept all 613 points of the law, the point was the whole reason to do it wasn't so that you could put them in bondage and trick them and just get them all tangled up in all sorts of legalistic nonsense like they were doing, creating doctrines of men and tying them up with foolishness. Because, for example, if you go to Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah chapter 1, you'll see that Israel and all their idolatry still offers things according to the law. And God says, I'm pretty much sick of what you're offering me. Even though you're doing things according to the law, God says that he's pretty much sick of it. And that's Isaiah chapter 1. Let me see the verses here. Let's see. Yeah, it's going to be in verse 11. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 11, God is pretty much sick of hearing from watching Israel, who is filled with idolatry. They'll offer some bullocks and everything according to the law, but they just don't care what they're doing. They're doing it to do it. They don't care. So Isaiah 1:11, as to what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me? Saith the Lord, I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. Now when ye come to appear before me, who hath required this at your hand to tread my courts? I bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. So he's saying, I'm weary to bear them. So they're doing certain things of the law, but they're doing it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it just to do it, and they have no heartfelt purpose in why they're doing what they're doing. And so God's saying, I'm sick of it. Even though they're trying to do certain things of the law without actually having a real purpose behind it. So when you come back to Matthew chapter 12, and you see that in verse 2, he says, but when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. They pretty much don't even know what they're talking about. And so, this is God's mindset towards these men who are just doing nothing but talking about the doctrines of men in order to fulfill their own agendas and purposes. And so verse 3, he says, but he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was an hungered, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. So we're seeing that in verse 3 and 4. But we're seeing him say in verse 3, the first couple of words out of his mouth, he says to them, have ye not read? So he's trying to drive that point home. Didn't you read about what David did historically, with Israel? And it says there, when he was an hungered, that they went, they that were with him, how they entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, but for only the priests. So for that we go back and we look at 1 Samuel chapter 21. The book of 1 Samuel chapter 21. And we're going to look at verse 3. And this is where David does this. He's running away from Saul. And he goes into the temple. And this is where it all comes in. So now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hollow bread. The young men have kept themselves, at least from winning. And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hollowed bread, for there was no bread there, but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So you see this take place where David asked for the bread because he's been running away from Saul for a while, and his men as well, and they eat of the what would be called holy bread, or the showbread, that you read originally about in Exodus chapter 25. This is where it first comes up. So you see this showbread, and yet it's given to David. David asked for this holy bread, which is not lawful for him to eat, but yet the priest gives it to him. He can go ahead and eat it. And the whole point, when you get back to Matthew chapter 12, is what he's saying is, have you not read that David did this? And yet it was for the right purpose, for the right heart. David did it with the right heart. David did it with the right purpose. According to the law, you're not supposed to eat it, but when it was done with the right purpose, the intents and the purposes of God came through. And so he did it with the right heart. So it's not about the agendas of men and the doctrines of men that are supposed to come through on this, but the plan and purpose of God, even in the prophetic program, which is what David was looking to obey and to do. So when we see this here in verse 3 and verse 4, we see how this was, he was rejected by Saul, he fled, he partook in that which was supposed to be only given to the priest, and yet he ate of it. And David and his men would enjoy, pretty much a similar thing. So you're seeing the same thing paralleled with what the Lord is doing, is that he's trying to eat some corn with his men, and yet he's being rejected by unbelieving Israel, to the point where they're saying, why are you eating this corn? So it's kind of a parallel historical account, but yet it's all, for the same purpose. It's the purpose of God that's going on. So we see that from 3 and 4. Then we get into verse 5. It says, Or have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? So you see this again. He says in verse 5, Have ye not read? He says it the second time to the Pharisees. This is the second time he says, Have ye not read? So he's trying to drive the point home. Don't you study? Don't you study? Have ye not read? Have ye not read? And he's saying in verse 5, Have ye not read the law in the law? So it's going from the example of King David in 1 Samuel to an example of the law. And the whole time they're talking about holy things, Sabbath day, the things of God. And for what he's saying in verse 5 is, Or have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days, going back to those Sabbath days, going all the way back to verse 1, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless. And of course, when he says profane the Sabbath, he's talking about how the priests are working on the Sabbath. They're taking those sacrifices, and to know more, look at Numbers, the book of Numbers chapter 28. The book of Numbers chapter 28 and verse 9. So the priests, on the actual Sabbath day, will be able and do offer sacrifices. So does that mean, in other words, according to the Lord, is he saying that they profane the Sabbath and are guilty? And the answer is no. So Numbers 28 verse 9, here's some instruction. And it says, And on the Sabbath day 2 lambs of the first year without spot, 2 tenth deals of flour for a meat offering, mingled with oil, and the drink offering thereof. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath, beside the continual burnt offering and his drink offering. So the priests are to actually do this on the Sabbath day. They are to offer 2 lambs 2 deals of flour. So they're to be working, offering sacrifices on the Sabbath day. So when we see this going back to verse 5, he says, have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? So he's saying that the priests are blameless. So why are you so concerned about, saying, don't pick corn? If the priests can go into the temple and offer sacrifices, that's work. So if they're so adherent to saying, don't do any work, Exodus 31 says you shouldn't work, you should do nothing but rest, and to even pick corn is a violation of that law. And he says, well, then you should be taking the priests and taking a look at them. You should be taking a look at King David, taking a look at him. So essentially, he's showing them how wrong they are for taking that man-made doctrine. And so he says that in verse 5. How the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless. And so he says, but I say unto you that in this place, verse 6, is one greater than the temple. So he's saying that, and this is a good deity verse for them as the Lord goes through Israel. What he's saying is that when it comes to the temple, the Lord's saying, I'm one greater than the temple. As far as offering sacrifices, offering, the priests in the temple and the sacrifices in the temple and the laws that go in the temple, I'm the one greater than the temple itself, is what the Lord's telling the Pharisees who aren't understanding it from the beginning. So he's trying to say, one greater than the temple itself is standing right in front of you. The one that's greater than the temple is standing here. And that's what he's trying to illustrate to the Pharisees who are too busy trying to make up man-made laws saying, don't pick corn on the Sabbath day. Don't do that. Don't do this. Making up rules just to find some reason to get them into trouble. And so he says that in verse 6. And in verse 7 he says, but if he had known what this meaneth, I would have mercy and not sacrifice. You would not have condemned the guiltless. And then this actually goes back to Hosea chapter 6. We won't turn there necessarily, but this goes back to Hosea, where he's saying, I would have mercy and not sacrifice. So, and this goes a little bit with what we were talking about in Isaiah chapter 1, where we were saying, you can sacrifice all day, but if you're doing it with the wrong reasons, I'm sick of getting your sacrifices because they don't mean anything to you. You're doing them for no reason, Israel. You're sacrificing bulls and goats and everything, but you don't care. So if you don't care, why should I care? If you're sacrificing these things and they mean nothing to you to sacrifice them, what makes you think I care? If you don't care, Israel. So we see this in verse 7. And that goes to show a little point about, when people do things for a reason that they don't know why, and they don't care why they do them, you can see that a spiritual lesson taken out of this, out of Isaiah chapter 1. If people go to a church building every week and they have no heart's desire to be there, or they're looking for something that God's not going to be giving out in this dispensation, they're looking for a healing, or they're looking for money, or they're looking for whatever they're looking for, and or they're there and they don't know what they're doing there, or they're there and they just stand there totally bored, or just stand, sit, kneel, stand, sit, kneel, and they don't know pretty much what they're doing. They're just acting like robots, bored and confused. Then they're there for the same reason. And God's saying, well, you can sit, stand, and kneel, sing all day long, but your heart's not in any of this. So, and it has the same mentality as Isaiah chapter 1. So, we see that in verse 7, that he would not have condemned the guiltless. Verse 8, he says, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. So there's another deity verse. Not only does he say one greater than the temple is here, but when it comes to the Sabbath day, he says anything concerning it. Jesus says, well, I'm God of the Sabbath day. If anything, I made the Sabbath day. It's been, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, is what he's saying. So I'm greater than the temple, and I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, is what Jesus Christ is saying to Israel. So he's trying to drive the point home that if you need to look to anyone for instruction, it's God himself who's standing right in front of him. So we see that from verse 8. And then verse 9, he says, and when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. And in verse 10, and behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? So the whole point is, after this, he goes, after having a conversation. I mean, they're still with him. But he goes into a synagogue, and there's a man with a hand that's withered. And so it's still the Sabbath day. And they ask him, they say, well, are you going to go heal that man on the Sabbath day? You can't do any work on the Sabbath day. You're not going to heal that man and make that man's hand perfectly normal, are you? And so, you see that take place in verse verse 9 and 10, as he goes to the synagogue. And so they're trying to, and they're saying this, that they might find a reason to accuse him. And that's all they're doing. The whole reason for what they're doing in the first place is so they can find a reason to accuse the Lord, not follow him, not obey him, not believe him, not repent and be baptized. None of those things which they should have done. But they're looking for reasons to accuse the God of the universe, which they're not going to find. Unless they make something up, which is them being liars, pretty much. And you're seeing that take place in verse 10. And you can see parallel accounts. We won't turn to it, but Mark talks about this same event happening in Mark chapter 3, verse 1 through 5. And Luke, his parallel account takes place in Luke chapter 6, verse 6 through 11. So those parallel accounts do the same thing. And in verse 10 is his answer. He says, and behold, there was a man which had his hand withered, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? So we're going back to seeing that. Verse 11, what we see here, it says, and he said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? So he's saying that on the Sabbath day, if there's someone who has a sheep and it falls into a pit, are you going to just sit there and wait one day not to lift up the sheep out of the pit and not give help to, are you not going to show mercy? Are you not going to give any help? Which was what we were just mentioning in Hosea chapter 6, where God desires mercy rather than sacrifice. If there's someone who needs help, whether it be a withered hand, which we're reading about here in the synagogue, whether it be a man who has a sheep fall into a pit, whether it be his disciples that are hungry and they just want to start picking the corn off of the thing, are you supposed to not allow any of this to happen on the Sabbath day? The Pharisees seem to think so. The Pharisees seem to think, well, there's no work to be done on the Sabbath day at all. And so the Lord is rebuking them for that and trying to ask them, he's pretty much giving them examples and telling them, have you not read? King David was able to do this and it was okay. And the priests are able to do this and it's okay. Because it's all about the purpose and plan of God. They're not doing this to be violators. They're not doing this to, get away with mass destruction and go against the plan of God. They're doing this, it all is a part of what goes on in the prophetic program, law and everything. So we see this in verse 11. And if we look real quick at Exodus chapter 23, in verse 4, that's what he's talking about here. As he gives the example to the Pharisees, what he says to them is, he says, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? So he gives that example because in Exodus chapter 23 and verse 4, there's just such a law that says to help out your neighbor if such a thing happens for Israel. So in Exodus chapter 23 lead thine enemy's ox, or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldst forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. So you're seeing, laws being written, saying if your enemy has an ass or a donkey or a sheep or whatever, go out and help him. Let alone, Sabbath day information. So you're seeing this take place there, and that's in verse 11. And he says, verse 11, what man shall there be among you? Thou shalt have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? Verse 12, Matthew 12:12, how much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath days? So he's saying, wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath days? The Lord's trying to drive the point home to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's better to do well on the Sabbath days than it is to nitpick and to accuse and to do all these things that are incorrect with the law and create man-made doctrines to accuse God of all people, God, manifest in the flesh, concerning the Scriptures. And so we see that in verse 12. And he says, how much then is a man better than a sheep? In his example of if a sheep falls into a pit. And we've seen different examples where they talk about how God knows the ravens. We've seen that in Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. How God knows the ravens, how much more, the needs of man. So he's saying, and if a sheep falls into a pit, how much more should one man help another man? So we see that from verse 12. And then he says, then saith he, in verse 13, then saith he to the man, stretch forth thine hand, and he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. So the Lord heals on the Sabbath day, and the man with the withered hand is healed, as far as his hand goes. And then he says, we see in verse 14, it says, then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. So the Pharisees were pretty much upset and embarrassed that not only could he prove what he was talking about through the law and through historical examples of Israel in the Scriptures, but then he also went and healed a man on the Sabbath. So he did well on the Sabbath, and he proved his point through history and through historical figures and through the law in the Scriptures. And that made the Pharisees so upset that they went and they held a council. They held a meeting. They got a meeting together. How could they destroy him? How could they destroy Jesus Christ? They were so upset that he could constantly be attacked and handle the attack. And not only handle it, but go back and go back at him. To the point where they said, we need to have a meeting and figure out how are we going to destroy Jesus. And that's how upset religion is at God. Because they're so fake, they're not real. And who they are in the heart, God's trying to get them to be real. So we see that in verse 14. And then as we see the examples, as the Lord was talking about in Matthew chapter 12, verse 12, and Matthew chapter 12, verse 13, about the sheep and loving thy neighbor, if you look back at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, this is where you'll hear that famous verse. This is a very, very, very famous verse, but it was also part of the law. Leviticus 19, verse 18 is what we're looking at, where it says, thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. So you hear that quite a bit. Love thy neighbor as thyself, and I love my neighbor as myself, and so on and so forth. But the point was that was the law in Israel. Not that it's not something that is worthy to be obeyed today. It's a good command, and love is the fulfillment of the law, and this was, when you hear love thy neighbor as thyself, that was the law. You had to do it. It's Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. People could stone you with stones in Israel if you didn't do what was commanded. So, but the point is that compassion is more important than nitpicking and accusing and creating man-made doctrines to try to spin the law into something that it's not. So, we see that there, and let's see, we go to verse 14, which we already did. See that the Pharisees went out and held a council against him to how they might destroy him. So we're seeing how the Pharisees are they're getting further and further angry at what the Lord's doing when all he's doing is fulfilling Scripture. He's going forward doing exactly what the Scripture said he was going to do, and that's getting the Pharisees upset because they're the ones who want to be the guys in charge and want to tell the people what to do. We know that so many people in religion today, they're the ones who want to tell the people what to do. And they'll say, you don't need to read that Bible. Just let us tell you what to do. Let us tell you who to talk to. Let us tell you where to send your money at. Let us tell you how much money to send. And let us tell you what you need to be studying. And so that's pretty much religion. When you say, well, I don't need to follow you, I've got a Bible. I can study it, read it, rightly divide it, and understand what God's telling me. That's when they get upset at you. So, with that, we'll stop here for today. We'll continue next time in Matthew chapter 12, and we'll go into verse 15 next week. And we'll stop here for now.